Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey through the pages of the past. You've found your way to the Sleepy Historian, where stories unfold not with urgency or clamor, but with the slow, steady rhythm of time itself. This is boring history for sleep, designed not to stir adrenaline, but to ease the mind into rest. You might think of it as falling asleep to boring history. A gentle kind of company where soft storytelling, historical detail, and calm narration blend together like the slow turning of an old parchment page. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. I'd love to know where you're listening from, and perhaps what time it is as you drift into the night. It's strangely comforting to imagine others scattered across the world, listening together, dozing off to the same quiet stories. So if you'd like, leave a comment below. You never know whose small note might bring a little sense of connection in the stillness. Tonight, our theme is both simple and profound. We will wander into the world of the medieval farmer, a world built upon soil, sweat, and steady endurance. The video is titled, Boring History for Sleep, the Jaw-Dropping Truth About How Medieval Farmers Survived. But rest assured, the jaw-dropping truth here will not leap or jolt. It will unfold quietly, like mist over a plowed field at dawn. This is bedtime relaxation and soft storytelling, a soft-spoken history documentary crafted for fans of Roman history, archaeology, and calm narration, as well as anyone who longs for relaxing history to fall asleep to. Over the next 2 hours, we will explore the daily rhythm of medieval life, pausing in the fields, walking through the narrow lanes of small villages, listening for the sounds of wooden wheels on dirt paths. We'll move from the humblest cottages to the halls of lords, considering how those who toiled and those who commanded shaped each other's existence. Along the way, we will notice details, the weight of a wooden plow, the flicker of lamplight against whitewashed walls, the muted chatter of market days. Our script will unfold in 4 distinct segments, each with its own quiet current. First, we'll immerse ourselves in the daily lives of ordinary farmers, moving hour by hour through a medieval day. Then, we'll trace the life of a single figure or moment in history, something grounded, unhurried, yet revealing. Next, we'll wander into mystery and archaeology, exploring artifacts, forgotten tools, and the quiet whispers left in the soil. Finally, we'll look to the social contrasts, the gulf between peasants and elites, and the way such contrasts shaped the rhythm of survival. So, dim the lights if you wish, settle into comfort, and let this calm bedtime storytelling carry you into sleep. History, in its slowest and most patient telling, is not about battles or kings. It is about the rhythm of life itself. Let's begin. Imagine, if you will, the very first moments of a medieval morning. Long before the sun has fully risen, before the fields are bright with daylight, the air carries a dampness that seeps into clothes and walls alike. The farmhouse is small, timber beams creaking softly as the family begins to stir. There are no alarm clocks, no glowing screens, just the rhythm of nature itself. The cocks crow, the distant lowing of cattle, the muted shuffle of neighbors in their own yards. For the medieval farmer, the day began in the half-light, often when mist still clung to the hedgerows. The house itself was simple, packed earth underfoot, or at best rough wooden planks, walls of wattle and daub, with smoke from the hearth lingering in the rafters long after the evening fire had gone out. A single room might serve as kitchen, dining space, and sleeping quarters. In some homes, animals, goats, chickens, perhaps even a calf, shared the same space, their warmth a welcome but sometimes noisy presence. The first task was always the fire. A smoldering ember from the night before, if carefully banked, could be coaxed back into flame. Otherwise, new sparks had to be struck from flint and steel, a patient process of kindling and breath. The glow of the hearth was more than light or heat. It was the center of domestic life, the place where bread would be baked, porridge boiled, and warmth sustained. Breakfast was modest. Bread from yesterday's bake, perhaps dipped in a thin broth, or accompanied by a wedge of cheese if the household had a cow or sheep that produced enough milk. Sometimes it was only ale, weak, home-brewed ale, safer than water drawn from stream. Children might nibble on a handful of oats or dried peas. These were not meals of abundance, but meals of necessity, the fuel for hours of labor ahead. Stepping outside, the air was often sharp. Fields stretched beyond, not neat squares of modern farms, but irregular patches of open land, divided into strips. Each family's strips were scattered among others, part of the communal system of agriculture that bound the village together. To work one's land was to work in sight of neighbors, to share both hardship and rhythm. The tools of labor were simple: a heavy wooden plow tipped with iron, a hoe, a wooden rake, a scythe. These implements wore quickly and demanded care. A blacksmith in the village might res-hoe plowshares or repair metal fittings, but much of the day-to-day maintenance fell on the farmer himself, patching handles, sharpening edges with a whetstone. Tasks varied by season, and so the morning scene shifted with the calendar. In spring, plowing and sowing dominated. Long lines drawn through damp earth, seeds scattered by hand with practiced motions. In summer, weeding, tending livestock, and mending fences filled the hours. Autumn brought the harvest, back-breaking but essential, each sheaf of grain gathered by hand, tied, and stacked. Winter mornings were quieter but harsher, with work focused on feeding animals, mending tools, and enduring the cold. The rhythm of these mornings was steady, measured not by minutes but by the sun's ascent. Farmers labored with the knowledge that every stroke of the hoe or sweep of the scythe carried significance. To fall behind in planting or harvesting was to risk hunger. And so, the work was done not with speed, but with constancy. Children, too, played their part. Even the very young carried water, gathered sticks for fuel, or kept watch over geese and pigs. Older children helped in the fields, learning by repetition rather than instruction. It was in this way that knowledge passed down, through shared tasks, quiet guidance, and a natural unfolding of daily routines. As the morning stretched into midday, the warmth of the sun grew stronger. The damp of dawn lifted, leaving the air scented with freshly turned soil or the sweet smell of cut hay. Birds darted over fields, chasing insects stirred by the plow. The farmer's body settled into the work, a rhythm as old as agriculture itself. Bend, lift, swing, step, repeat. And yet, even within such monotony, there was variation. The soil might resist or yield easily, weather could turn suddenly. A gentle drizzle might soften the ground, making sowing easier, while a sudden downpour could force a halt. Farmers lived with the constant awareness that much lay beyond their control. They could prepare, plant, and pray, but ultimately, the harvest was at the mercy of nature. By midday, laborers paused. Meals were simple, bread again, with onions or beans, washed down with ale or diluted wine in some regions. In the busiest seasons, the meal was eaten in the fields, workers sitting on the earth itself, resting briefly before resuming. Conversation might drift across the strips of land, neighbors calling to one another, exchanging news, or simply remarking on the weather. There was little silence in the medieval countryside, but it was not the noise of machines or engines. Instead, it was the layered soundscape of nature and labor, the bleating of sheep, the creak of wooden carts, the call of birds, the steady scrape of iron against soil. A kind of music, quiet and repetitive, marking the hours until evening. And so the morning world of the medieval farmer passed. Not hurried, not idle, but balanced in that enduring rhythm of necessity. It was a world of small comforts and great demands, of constancy rather than drama. A rhythm that, even now, if you listen closely, seems to echo in the background of history, carrying us gently toward the afternoon. As the sun crept higher, the light mellowed into a steady glow that spread across the countryside. The dew of morning had long burned away, leaving the ground firmer underfoot, the air filled with the dry scents of hay and soil. For medieval farmers, the afternoon was not a time of leisure, but of pressing labor, continuing the long sequence of tasks that define survival. In the fields, the work intensified. Crops needed tending, whether weeding the stubborn patches between rows of barley or guiding oxen as they pulled a wooden plow across strips of land. The sound of iron scraping earth echoed steadily, accompanied by the low grunts of animals straining under their yokes. Farmers walked behind, slow and deliberate, hands gripping wooden handles worn smooth by years of use. Dust clung to clothing, and the sun warmed backs already bent from hours of labor. Beyond the fields, livestock required care. Afternoon was often the time for herding animals to grazing pastures or collecting them again for the evening. Sheep and goats were guided along narrow paths, their bells ringing softly in rhythm with their steps. Pigs wandered in the woods, rooting beneath fallen leaves, watched carefully by children tasked with ensuring none strayed too far. Cattle, larger and more valuable, were handled with greater caution, guided with sticks or ropes by men who knew their temperaments well. In the village, women continued the domestic rhythm. Afternoon meant grinding grain with heavy quern stones, a repetitive motion that demanded strength and patience. The sound of stone against stone was a familiar backdrop, punctuated by the crackle of fire as bread baked in clay ovens or in communal bakehouses. Wool was spun by hand, flax fibers combed and prepared for weaving, and clothing mended stitch by stitch. Each task, though small in itself, was a thread in the greater fabric of survival. Children mirrored their parents' duties, their work scaled to their size. A young boy might carry buckets of water from a stream, sloshing and heavy, while a girl gathered herbs from the edges of fields, parsley, sage, or nettles for flavor and medicine alike. Play and work blurred. Chasing a goose or climbing a tree could easily turn into a chore, and chores into lessons about the wider world. The afternoon was also a time of village interaction. Farmers passing each other on paths might pause briefly to exchange words. Weather, crop conditions, or the health of livestock. News traveled slowly, mostly by word of mouth. And so these brief conversations were a form of connection, weaving the community together. The pace of life may have been slower than our own, but it was never isolated. Neighbors were ever present, part of the shared rhythm of survival. As the day moved toward evening, fatigue grew. Bodies ached from bending, lifting, and walking. Skin bore the sting of sun or the chill of wind, depending on the season. Still, the work carried on. There was no true end to a farmer's labor. Only pauses, brief intermissions before the next necessity arose. The land did not rest, and so neither did those who depended on it. By late afternoon, preparations began for the evening meal. If livestock had been grazing, they were brought closer to the village, penned or tethered safely. Chickens returned to roost, their clucking forming part of the familiar evening chorus. Children carried wood for the fire, while women stirred pots of stew, their scents drifting across small lanes. Onions, leeks, beans, and sometimes a sliver of salted meat or fish if fortune allowed. The hearth once again became the focal point of the home. Smoke curled upward into thatch, sometimes escaping through a small hole, sometimes lingering stubbornly inside. Families gathered around low tables or simple benches, bowls shared, spoons carved from wood passed from hand to hand. The meal was not abundant, but it was communal, carrying with it the reassurance of shared sustenance. After eating, tasks shifted once more. Tools used in the fields were cleaned, inspected, and put away for the next day. Harnesses for oxen were hung, buckets emptied, and clothing set to dry if soaked by rain or sweat. The rhythm of preparation, putting things in order for tomorrow, was itself a form of labor, ensuring that when dawn arrived again, the work could resume without delay. The evening also offered a brief moment of community gathering. Neighbors might meet at the village green or along paths, sharing ale brewed at home, exchanging songs, or telling stories by the fading light. These were not grand entertainments, but simple, steady rituals, moments of laughter, of familiarity, of voices mingling in the dusk. A traveling minstrel or peddler passing through added a touch of novelty. But even without such visitors, Evenings carried their own quiet comfort. As the sun sank, shadows stretched across the fields. The landscape grew still, colors fading into muted shades of gray and blue. Farmers watched the sky for signs of the weather to come. Clouds hinting at rain, clear skies promising frost, the shape of the moon carrying its own subtle omens. These observations were not idle. They informed decisions, shaping how tomorrow's labor might unfold. Inside, homes dimmed. Light came only from the hearth or from rushlights. Thin reeds dipped in tallow, burning with a faint, flickering glow. Shadows moved across walls, soft and wavering. Conversation quieted and fatigue deepened. Some prayed, murmuring words learned by repetition, while others simply stretched out on straw-filled mattresses. Children nestled beside parents, warmth shared under woolen blankets. Evening marked the close of visible labor, but not of the farmer's concerns. Thoughts of crops, weather, and provision lingered even as eyelids grew heavy. The medieval farmer lived within a cycle without end, where each day mirrored the last, and the future was always uncertain. Yet within this rhythm was also a kind of peace, a surrender to necessity, an acceptance that life moved at the pace of seasons, not of individual will. And so, the days slipped into night, the hum of the village softening until only the occasional bark of a dog or the distant call of an owl broke the silence. Tomorrow would bring the same rhythm again, and the medieval farmer, weary but resolute, would rise once more with the cock's crow. When the last streaks of daylight vanished beyond the low hills, the medieval village entered a slower rhythm, one that was quieter but never completely still. Darkness came more swiftly than we might expect today, for there were no street lamps or electric bulbs to extend the day. Once the sun was gone, light belonged only to fire, to candles, and to the faint, silvery glow of the moon. Inside cottages, families prepared for rest. The hearth, still glowing from the evening meal, was carefully tended. Embers banked, ash shifted so that a faint warmth would remain through the hours of night. This was not only for comfort, but also for survival, for in the depth of winter, fire was a fragile guardian against cold. Sometimes, a family would gather close to the hearth even after eating, stretching out their hands, speaking in low tones, or simply sitting in silence as the flames dwindled. Sleeping arrangements were simple. Straw mattresses, sometimes covered with coarse linen or woolen blankets, provided rest. In poorer households, several family members might share a single bed, lying side by side for warmth. In some cases, children slept on the floor near parents, while animals remained close at hand in adjoining spaces. Privacy was minimal, and comfort was relative, yet sleep came more easily to bodies weary from long hours of labor. The village itself quieted as doors closed, but faint sounds lingered. The distant bark of dogs, the rustle of wind through thatched roofs, the creak of wooden shutters swaying slightly on their hinges. Sometimes, owls called from nearby trees, or foxes cried in the distance. These noises were familiar, a nightly backdrop that reassured as much as it unsettled. People were accustomed to them, and so they blended into the rhythm of slumber. Yet, night also carried its own uncertainties. In a world without secure locks, the darkness was a space of vulnerability. Wolves prowled the edges of forests in some regions, while thieves or wanderers might slip along the margins of villages. To guard against such dangers, communities often relied on custom and routine. Animals brought inside, tools and goods secured, neighbors keeping an unspoken watch for anything unusual. In larger towns, night watchmen walked slowly through the streets, calling out the hours, their voices echoing softly against timber walls. In small farming villages, such measures were rarer, and trust and familiarity carried more weight. Now was also a time for ritual. Before lying down to sleep, many families prayed, reciting familiar words that offered comfort against the unknown. The church bell, when present, might toll at set hours, its sound drifting across the fields, reminding villagers of the cycle of sacred time that stretched even into darkness. The steady repetition of these prayers and bells wove night into the larger fabric of spiritual life, where rest was not only physical but also a pause within a world shaped by faith. Inside homes, light was scarce. Rushlights, thin reeds dipped in animal fat, burned dimly, flickering and faint. Their glow was uneven, often producing more smoke than flame. Candles, when available, were treasured, saved for special moments or necessary work after dusk. For the most part, villagers accepted the darkness, moving slowly, conserving sight and energy, letting the night be what it was. Dreams carried their own significance in this world. Many believed that dreams could be messages, warnings, or glimpses of the divine. A vivid dream might be retold at dawn, its meaning pondered quietly. The thin veil between waking and sleeping was thought to reveal truths not visible in daylight. This gave the act of sleeping itself a kind of gravity, more than simple rest. It was another layer of existence, a space where the spiritual world might whisper. Though labor dominated their lives, villagers found moments of quiet connection before sleep. Parents told children simple tales, often stories of saints, animals, or faraway lands, passed down through generations. These were not dramatic performances, but soft, familiar retellings that soothed restless minds. The rhythm of a mother's voice or the steady cadence of a father's words became part of the lullaby of village life, blending with the natural sounds of night. As the hours deepened, true stillness descended. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys, paths lay empty, and fields rested under moonlight. The stars above shone more brightly than most of us can imagine today, unchallenged by artificial light. The Milky Way stretched clearly across the sky, a river of pale brilliance watched by those who lingered before finally lying down. For farmers, this vast expanse was both humbling and constant, a reminder that their small labors were part of a larger cycle, turning endlessly above them. Midnight passed unnoticed by most, for the rhythm of sleep came earlier in this world. Yet some awoke in the small hours, stirred by cold, hunger, or the simple restlessness of the body. This segmented sleep was not unusual. People often slept in two stretches, waking briefly to tend the fire, to check on animals, or even to talk quietly before returning to rest. What might seem disruptive today was once ordinary, part of the natural flow of human sleep before the invention of artificial light. By the final hours of night, fatigue settled deeply. The body, worn from labor, yielded to rest. Dreams continued, fires dwindled, and the village lay hushed, waiting for the cock's crow to announce the return of light. For the medieval farmer, night was not merely an interlude between days of toil. It was its own essential part of survival. It renewed the strength needed for plow and scythe, for herding and weaving, for sowing and harvesting. Thus the cycle of a single day closed, its rhythm folding seamlessly into the next. Life in a medieval village was marked not by dramatic moments, but by the slow repetition of these daily and nightly patterns. In the quiet of darkness, in the stillness of shared sleep, the farmer found the only true rest that life allowed. Fleeting, simple, and utterly essential. History is not only shaped by kings and nobles. Sometimes, the voices that reach us across centuries are those of men and women who lived close to the soil, who recorded their thoughts not in gilded manuscripts, but in plain words of instruction. One such figure is Walther of Henley, a name less known than monarchs or knights, yet one whose words allow us a rare glimpse into the mindset of medieval farming life. Walther lived in England during the late 13th century, at a time when farming practices formed the very backbone of society. While much about his personal life remains obscure, his birth, his family, his precise village, the text he left behind, Ludight de Husbandry or the Husbandry, has carried his voice forward through time. It is not a dramatic work. There are no tales of battles, no sweeping chronicles of dynasties. Instead, it is a manual, a calm, methodical set of instructions for how to manage a farm. And in that simplicity, it reveals an entire world. Imagine Walther himself, perhaps an older man by the time he wrote, shaped by years of working land and observing the trials of neighbors. His tone is measured, practical, and quietly insistent. He speaks of oxen, of plows, of the wisdom of keeping tools in good order. He advises against wasting time or resources, warning that negligence leads directly to hunger. His words remind us that survival in the Middle Ages was not an abstract concern, but a daily calculation. He recommends, for instance, the careful management of plow teams. Oxen were precious, slow, but steady workers of the soil. To overwork them or to neglect their care was to risk losing the ability to till land at all. Walther's advice is filled with such cautions. Do not let your servants idle when work needs doing. Keep watch over your seed, so none is wasted. Ensure your barns are sound and your roofs free from holes, lest rain undo the labor of months. There is a rhythm to his writing that mirrors the rhythm of the fields themselves. Practical repetition, gentle reminders, steady counsel. He warns of laziness, but his tone is not harsh. It is the voice of a man who has seen the consequences and wishes to spare others the same fate. For us today, his words may seem ordinary, almost obvious, but in his time, they were vital. In a world where a single bad harvest could mean famine, such practical wisdom was as valuable as any treasure. Walther also reflects the broader structure of medieval society. His words are aimed not only at farmers themselves, but also at landholders, at those responsible for overseeing labor and ensuring the smooth functioning of estates. He understood the delicate balance between those who worked the soil and those who depended upon their work. His manual is therefore not just about farming. It is about management, responsibility, and the quiet acknowledgement that the prosperity of a lord or manor ultimately rested on the bent backs of peasants in the fields. In describing the tasks of farming, Walther indirectly paints a portrait of the people. He speaks of women's work in dairying and spinning, of men guiding the plow, of servants whose diligence or neglect could make the difference between plenty and want. Through his instructions, we glimpse not only the soil, but also the lives entwined with it, the small details of human effort and endurance. One striking aspect of Walther's text is his attention to timing. He urges that work be done in its season, neither too soon nor too late. Planting, harvesting, tending animals, all must follow the natural rhythm of the year. To miss the proper moment was to court disaster. This deep respect for timing reminds us how closely medieval life was bound to cycles beyond human control. No matter how skilled a farmer might be, he remained at the mercy of weather, disease, and chance. Walther's words acknowledge this reality, offering not certainty, but preparedness. It is worth pausing here to consider how unusual it is that such a voice has survived. Most farmers left no written record. Their labor was invisible to history, preserved only in the soil itself. Walther, however, captured in writing what countless others practiced silently. His manual was copied, translated, and circulated, spreading its quiet wisdom through England and beyond. And so, his words remain, centuries later, as a faint echo of a medieval mind concerned above all with survival. Through Walther, we see the medieval farmer not as a faceless figure bent over a plow, but as a thinking person, weighing choices, planning for the future, striving to manage both land and people with care. His is the perspective of someone who knew that life was precarious, but who also believed that diligence, order, and foresight could steady the balance. In this way, the biography of Walther of Henley is less about one man than about the countless farmers whose daily struggles he represents. His voice, calm and practical, bridges the centuries to remind us of the unchanging truths of agriculture. That land requires respect, that labor demands constancy, and that survival rests upon careful attention to small details. As the daylight hours of his life faded, Walther may never have imagined that his words would travel so far in time. Yet here we are, centuries later, still listening to his advice, still picturing oxen in the furrow, still hearing the gentle admonition to work steadily, carefully, and in season. His is the quiet biography of the soil itself, carried forward not in glory, but in the enduring rhythm of the fields. The story of medieval farmers cannot be told without acknowledging the shadow that loomed constantly over their lives: famine. In a world where survival rested on the narrow margin between a successful harvest and a failed one, the threat of hunger was never distant. A bad season of weather, a flood, or an outbreak of crop disease could tip entire communities into hardship. And yet, in this fragile balance, we find a story of remarkable resilience, an endurance that defined not only individuals, but the shape of medieval society itself. One of the most striking episodes of famine in European history came in the early 14th century, often called the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. For those who lived through it, this was not a single disaster, but a cascade of misfortunes. Heavy rains fell across northern Europe year after year, saturating fields that had once yielded abundance. Crops rotted before they could ripen. Harvests failed, grain prices soared, and the stores of food that communities relied upon dwindled rapidly. Imagine the farmer in these years. He had sown his seed with care, following the rhythms of season and soil, only to see it washed away by relentless rain. The fields, once neat with furrows, became sodden stretches of mud. Hay for animals spoiled in the damp, leaving cattle underfed and weak. In barns and cottages, anxiety grew as barrels emptied faster than they could be refilled, and as each passing day of rain reminded families that the year's labor might yield nothing but hunger. Famine was not only about empty stomachs, it reshaped the rhythm of life. Meals grew smaller, stretching scraps of bread or thin broth as far as possible. Families sold tools or livestock to afford what grain they could find, weakening their ability to recover in the future. Children were sent to beg in nearby towns. Some wandered further in search of food, adding to the sense of dislocation that famine always brings. The fabric of daily life, so carefully maintained in ordinary times, began to fray under the strain. And yet, even in this darkness, resilience appeared. Farmers adapted as best they could, turning to alternative foods: peas, beans, nuts, or wild plants. Herbs and roots that were normally overlooked became valuable sources of nourishment. Communities shared what they could, for the survival of one family was often bound to the survival of neighbors. The village was not merely a collection of households. It was a network of interdependence. Chroniclers of the time described the famine in sober tones. They record not only the hunger, but also the social strain it created. Theft increased, disputes flared, and despair spread. Yet they also note the persistence of routines. Fields were still plowed, even if their yield was uncertain. Cattle were still tended, even if they grew thin. In the midst of famine, the work did not cease. To stop labor was to abandon hope, and so, with weary determination, farmers pressed on. It is important to remember that famine was not rare. The Great Famine stands out for its scale, but smaller shortages occurred regularly. A late frost, a summer drought, or the spread of crop disease could devastate a single village or region. This constant uncertainty shaped the mentality of medieval farmers. They lived always with a sense of fragility, aware that nature's moods were beyond their control. Perhaps it is this awareness that gave their routines such gravity. The plow, the sowing, the harvest were acts of faith as much as acts of labor. Survival strategies extended beyond food. In hard times, families might turn to charity, appealing to monasteries or local lords for aid. The church, with its granaries and lands, often provided relief, though unevenly and never enough to eliminate suffering. Lords, too, had a stake in supporting their peasants, for without laborers, their estates would collapse. Thus, famine revealed not only the vulnerability of farmers, but also the interdependence of medieval society. Stories from the famine years remind us that resilience was not only physical, but also mental. The act of enduring, of rising each day to face the fields despite hunger, required a quiet courage. This courage was rarely celebrated in chronicles, yet it is perhaps the truest measure of the medieval farmer's strength. There are no grand victories, no dramatic triumphs, only the steady continuation of life under the most difficult circumstances. And when the rains finally eased, when harvest began to recover, farmers did not pause in relief. They resumed their rhythm, repaired their tools, and once again trusted the soil with their seed. The memory of hunger lingered, shaping habits for years to come. Barns were repaired with extra care, seed was guarded more closely, and prayers for good weather grew more fervent. The biography of famine, if we may call it that, is a collective story rather than that of a single figure. It is the story of thousands, of millions, who endured seasons of uncertainty and loss. It reminds us that medieval life was not only a cycle of work and rest, but also a cycle of risk and recovery. Farmers were bound not only to the soil, but to the fickle patterns of climate, to the chance of disease, and to the fragile chain of supply that could break so easily. In the soft retelling of this history, we are reminded not of drama, but of endurance. The medieval farmer, in famine or in plenty, continued his steady rhythm. He rose with the dawn, guided his oxen, tended his animals, and hoped that the harvest would be enough. That quiet persistence, repeated generation after generation, was the true foundation of survival. When famine finally loosened its grip, life in the countryside did not suddenly brighten into ease. For medieval farmers, recovery was not a quick process, but a slow rebuilding of both resources and spirit. The years of hunger had left marks upon the land, the animals, the homes, and the people themselves. Yet, as with so many other challenges, the response was not dramatic revival, but quiet persistence. Farmers did not abandon their way of life. Instead, they stepped once more into the steady rhythm of work that had sustained generations. The first step of recovery often began with the soil itself. Farmers needed to return to their fields, even if the land had suffered from flooding or erosion. Repairs to ditches, hedges, and pathways were essential to make the ground usable again. Heavy rains had left gullies and puddles, and these needed careful attention. A farmer's relationship with the land was one of constant negotiation, never permanent, always in need of renewal. To plow again after famine was more than labor. It was a signal of hope, a quiet act of trust that the future might yet yield enough to sustain life. Livestock, too, bore the marks of hardship. Cattle that had gone hungry in lean years were fewer, weaker, and less able to work. Rebuilding herds was a slow endeavor, requiring careful breeding and the steady gathering of fodder. Sheep, goats, and pigs each had to be tended with an eye toward restoring numbers. Farmers often relied on shared pastures, and cooperation among villagers ensured that animals could graze and multiply once more. There was a patience in this process, as the rhythms of birth and growth followed their own unchangeable pace. The recovery of families was just as gradual. Malnutrition left lingering weakness. Children who had endured famine sometimes carried its effects into adulthood, with smaller stature or fragile health. Villages remembered those lost to hunger, and absences at the table reminded survivors of the fragility of life. Yet, slowly, normal routines returned. Markets reopened with more goods to trade. Festivals resumed with greater gratitude, and families once again filled their cottages with the sounds of work and conversation. Memory, however, lingered. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 did not simply fade from experience. It shaped attitudes for decades. Farmers became more cautious, more intent on storing surplus grain when harvest allowed. Granaries were repaired or expanded, and methods of preserving food, drying, salting, smoking, were practiced more diligently. These measures were not luxuries, but necessities born of bitter memory. People learned, quite simply, that abundance could vanish, and preparation was the only defense. The church played an important role in recovery as well. Many monasteries that had given out grain during famine years became remembered as places of refuge, and donations and gratitude sometimes followed. Prayers for good harvests became more prominent in liturgy, and saints associated with fertility or protection of crops gained renewed devotion. Pilgrimages increased in some areas, as people sought divine favor to shield them from future catastrophe. In these ways, famine left not only scars on bodies and fields, but also marks on spiritual life. One might imagine a farmer, years later, speaking quietly to his children about the famine years. He would describe the endless rain, the empty stores, the meals that grew thinner each day. He would remind them to always keep seed grain in reserve, to guard against overconfidence, and to respect the uncertainty of the seasons. These lessons, passed down in hushed tones, became part of the cultural memory of survival. They were not grand tales of kings and battles, but they carried a weight of equal importance, shaping the way ordinary people approached their fragile world. Communities that survived famine often did so because of cooperation. Shared labor, mutual support, and neighborly exchange provided strength when individual households faltered. This habit of solidarity continued into recovery. Villagers might join together to repair a mill, rebuild a bridge, or replant a field that had been ruined. Collective resilience became both necessity and tradition, strengthening bonds that endured long after the famine had passed. As years rolled on, the famine receded into history, but the memory of hardship was never far away. Farmers might once again enjoy years of abundance, yet a sudden storm or a failed crop would quickly awaken old anxieties. In this way, recovery was never absolute. It was always tempered by the knowledge of vulnerability. The rhythm of planting and harvest carried not only hope, but also the memory of how easily hope could falter. And so, medieval farmers carried on, neither defeated by famine nor entirely free of its shadow. Their resilience lay not in ignoring hardship, but in remembering it, in shaping their daily routines around both the hope of harvest and the caution of experience. Theirs was a biography of endurance, quiet, steady, uncelebrated, yet deeply human. As we leave this chapter of famine and recovery, we carry with us an image of medieval life that is not defined by catastrophe, but by survival. It is the image of a farmer standing in his field after the storm, guiding his plow once more, the soil turning beneath him, the future uncertain yet possible. Archaeology, at its heart, is a patient conversation with the past. When we consider medieval farmers, much of what we know does not come from detailed chronicles or ornate records, but from the humble remnants left behind in the soil. A rusted blade, a fragment of pottery, the faint outline of a house's foundation. These small discoveries whisper of lives once lived in steady rhythm, lives that did not often find their way into written history. When archaeologists uncover the site of a medieval village, they do not stumble upon grand treasures. Instead, they find the quiet tools of survival. Iron plowshares worn smooth by use, wooden handles long since rotted away, but leaving impressions in the earth, sickles with curved edges dulled by the passage of centuries. These tools, simple in their design, reveal how carefully medieval farmers shaped their world. They remind us that history is not only about kings and castles, but about calloused hands guiding iron through soil, season after season. One recurring find is the heavy plowshare, a triangular piece of iron once fastened to a wooden plow. Its discovery tells us more than just the presence of farming. It tells us about the structure of society. The heavy plow, capable of turning the rich but stubborn clay soils of northern Europe, allowed entire regions to flourish. Its use suggests cooperation, for no single farmer could easily harness the oxen and manage the weight of the tool alone. A plowshare unearthed in a forgotten field is a reminder of communal labor, of families working together in fields that stretched beyond a single household's care. Pottery, too, provides silent evidence of daily life. Fragments of coarse cooking pots or glazed jugs emerge from the soil, sometimes decorated with simple lines or patterns. These were not luxury goods, but everyday vessels, used to carry water, cook stews, or store grain. Their shards, scattered and broken, speak of meals shared, of routines that anchored life through hardship and abundance alike. To hold such a fragment is to sense the presence of those who once gathered around fires, dipping bread in a broth, speaking in low voices after long days of labor. Sometimes archaeologists find traces of homes themselves. Post holes mark the outlines of timber cottages, small and modest, with thatched roofs long vanished. The arrangement of hearths and storage pits gives a sense of how families organized their space, where they cooked, where they slept, where they stored the seed that would ensure survival for the next year. Such reconstructions remind us that medieval life was not abstract, but deeply embodied. Each stone set in a hearth, each trench dug for drainage, was part of a family's effort to make life bearable in uncertain times. Even more subtle are the impressions of daily movement found in soil layers. A patch of compacted earth may reveal where generations walked to and from fields. Layers of ash suggest places of cooking or disposal. Animal bones, sometimes butchered, tell us what diets consisted of, whether in lean years or times of plenty. These remnants do not shout their message. They murmur quietly and persistently of ordinary endurance. There is also mystery in what is absent. Many tools were made of wood and leather, materials that rarely survive the centuries. We know, from rare finds preserved in waterlogged conditions, that farmers used wooden rakes, yokes, and buckets, all crafted with skill. These everyday objects, mostly vanished, remind us how much of the medieval world has slipped beyond recovery. The silence of absence is part of archaeology's story too, leaving us to imagine what once was, guided by faint impressions. What makes these discoveries so powerful is their ordinariness. A jeweled crown or an illuminated manuscript belongs to the world of the elite, preserved in treasure rooms and libraries. A rusted spade or a broken pot belongs to the countless anonymous farmers who sustained society but rarely left their names behind. To study these remnants is to give quiet recognition to their labor, to honor the persistence of lives lived without grandeur, yet filled with significance. Archaeology also reveals the seasonal rhythm of life. Layers of pollen trapped in soil cores show what crops were grown, when fields were cleared, how landscapes shifted from forest to farmland. Charcoal remains indicate slash-and-burn agriculture, while seed impressions and pottery hint at diets of barley, rye, or oats. These scientific traces confirm what chronicles often overlooked, that the pulse of medieval society beat in time with the sowing of seed and the harvesting of grain. At times, entire villages vanish from the record, their fields reclaimed by forest or heath. Excavations uncover outlines of houses, paths, and fields abandoned centuries ago. Why they were deserted is sometimes uncertain: disease, famine, shifting lords, or simply the pull of better land elsewhere. These ghost villages, revealed by archaeology, remind us of the fragility of settlement. They also echo the quiet courage of those who built, lived, and worked in places now lost to memory. To sit with these finds is to feel the calm persistence of history. No sudden drama, no loud announcement, just the slow revelation of lives carried forward in soil and stone. The medieval farmer, though often unnamed and unnoticed, has left behind enough fragments to let us listen, if we are patient. And in this listening, we find a peculiar peace, the sense that endurance itself is a kind of story, steady and unending. The medieval farmer lived in a world where the line between the material and the spiritual was thin. Soil and seed, rain and sunlight, all were tangible forces, but they were also understood as gifts or trials from powers beyond human control. To labor in the fields was not merely practical. It was bound to rituals, prayers, and symbolic practices that gave meaning to the toil of daily survival. Archaeology and old manuscripts alike provide glimpses of this world of belief, where farming was never just about food, but about the harmony between earth and heaven. Before the sowing of seed, for instance, farmers often sought blessing. In some regions, priests would walk the fields, sprinkling holy water, reciting prayers for abundance, and marking the soil with the sign of the cross. This was not only a religious act, but also a social one, gathering the village in hope and unity. Archaeologists sometimes find small lead or bronze tokens buried at the edges of fields, believed to be charms placed to protect crops from blight. Though their makers remain anonymous, these objects speak of a deep desire to shield the fragile promise of harvest from unseen forces. The agricultural calendar itself was woven with ritual. Candlemas in February marked the halfway point between winter and spring, often accompanied by prayers for good weather. Rogation days in late spring brought processions through the fields, where villagers sang hymns, invoked saints, and asked for protection against drought or storm. These rituals, though simple, helped anchor communities, reminding everyone that farming was not an isolated task, but a shared dependence on divine favor. Belief also shaped how tools and spaces were used. A plow might be blessed before its first use each season, its iron blade marked with holy water. The first sheaf of grain harvested was sometimes set aside as an offering, placed in churches or shrines to give thanks. Superstitions guided smaller actions too. Some farmers would not whistle while sowing, fearing it might call wind strong enough to scatter seed. Others avoided harvesting at night, believing that unseen spirits might spoil the work. In archaeological layers, traces of these practices appear faintly but suggestively. Clay figurines, fragments of charms, or unusual deposits in the soil hint at rituals long forgotten. In one village, a pair of shoes was found buried beneath a barn floor, possibly a form of protection against misfortune. In another, the skull of an ox was discovered carefully placed in a foundation trench, perhaps a symbol of strength offered to ensure the stability of the building. These discoveries blur the boundary between archaeology and folklore, leaving us to wonder how much of medieval farming was guided by silent ritual. The rhythms of belief extended to the household as well. In many cottages, hearths were seen as sacred spaces, the center of warmth and continuity. Some families carved small crosses above doorways or placed herbs in rafters to ward off misfortune. Even the act of storing grain carried ritual weight. Prayers were whispered as sacks were stacked, a gesture of hope that the store would last through the winter. The mundane and the spiritual intertwined, each reinforcing the other in the struggle for survival. Folk songs and proverbs also reveal the symbolic dimension of farming life. The seed must sleep before it wakes. One old saying went, linking the burial of seed in the ground with a cycle of death and rebirth. Another warned, he who mocks the soil will hunger, a reminder of both practical and spiritual consequence. These words, carried across generations, shaped attitudes toward work, weather, and the unpredictability of life. Festivals, too, celebrated the bond between people and land. Harvest festivals often mixed gratitude with relief, as villagers decorated churches with garlands of wheat and sang hymns of thanks. Some regions held playful rituals, weaving the last sheaf of grain into a figure called the corn dolly, believed to embody the spirit of the crop until it was returned to the soil at the next sowing. Though such practices varied widely, they all reflected the same idea, that survival was not only labor, but also relationship between human effort and forces unseen. The church, while dominant, did not erase local customs. Instead, it absorbed and reshaped them. Ancient traditions tied to the seasons or to natural cycles were often reinterpreted in Christian terms. Old fertility rites were transformed into prayers to saints, and festivals timed with equinoxes or solstices became framed within the liturgical calendar. This blending of sacred and practical allowed communities to carry forward older patterns of meaning while aligning them with official faith. For the medieval farmer, then, work was never purely mechanical. It was framed by ritual, imbued with belief, and softened by the presence of symbols. The soil was both field and altar, the harvest both sustenance and gift. In the calm, steady retelling of their lives, we see how belief provided comfort and structure, a way of finding order in a world shaped by uncertainty. As we listen to these echoes of ritual, we are reminded of the quiet human need to find meaning in routine, to To sow seed with a whispered prayer, to bless the plow, to share bread at a harvest feast. These were not grand ceremonies, but they bound people together, linking labor with faith and giving endurance a shape that was more than survival alone. And then disappeared. Villages that rang with the sound of axes and laughter, fields that bore crops for generations, lanes that echoed with the tread of feet, all have been swallowed by time. Today, they exist as faint humps in the ground, uneven lines beneath the grass, or clusters of stones that no longer rise into walls. Archaeology gives us glimpses of these forgotten places, and in doing so, it reminds us of the fragility of medieval life, balanced always between survival and abandonment. The reasons villages were deserted were many. Some were lost to famine or plague, others to shifting trade routes, changes in land ownership, or even the encroachment of woodland when fields fell out of use. In England alone, hundreds of such deserted medieval villages have been identified. In the soil, archaeologists find the outlines of houses, barns, and lanes, settlements once alive with people, now silent. Walking through such a site today, one feels the presence of lives once lived, not in haunting, but in quiet remembrance. Take, for example, the village of Warham Percy in Yorkshire, one of the most studied deserted villages in Europe. Its remains show rows of cottages, each modest and narrow, their stone footings still traceable on the grass. The outlines of paths connect them to what was once a small church, still standing, where prayers echoed for centuries. Excavations there have revealed pottery shards, iron tools, and the bones of animals once kept for food and labor. What is striking is not grandeur but ordinariness. The same pots, plowshares, and hearths found elsewhere, all confirming the rhythm of life that bound medieval farmers together. The story of Warham Percy, like many such villages, is not of sudden destruction but of gradual decline. Harvests weakened, population shifted, and slowly families moved away. A house left empty one season might collapse the next. Roof timbers fell, walls sagged, paths grew over with weeds. Within a generation or two, the heart of the village no longer beat, and the place was given back to the soil. Yet even as life faded, the landscape retained memory. Field boundaries still visible in the grass, terraces carved into hillsides showing where crops once grew. Elsewhere, archaeology has revealed villages abandoned during the Black Death of the mid-14th century. Here, the silence was more abrupt. Graves expanded rapidly, cottages fell empty, and communities never recovered. These sites often carry a heavier stillness, the suddenness of absence more sharply felt. Yet even here, artifacts remain to remind us that life was once steady and continuous. Tools dropped where they were last used, ceramics broken in kitchens that no longer stand, traces of hearth fires long extinguished. The memory of deserted villages is not only archaeological, but cultural. In folklore, stories often linger of places swallowed by earth or lost to misfortune. Legends speak of bells that can still be heard beneath the ground, or of ghostly ploughmen seen at dusk. These tales, though shaped by imagination, reflect the real awareness that life could vanish from a place, leaving only faint traces behind. In this way, even myths preserve the memory of forgotten landscapes. For the farmers who lived in such places, there was no thought of desertion at the start. They built their cottages with care, laid hearthstones, fenced their gardens, and marked their fields. Each generation likely believed the village would endure, that their children and grandchildren would plow the same land. The eventual abandonment was not a planned act, but a slow realization, carried out step by step until the rhythm of life shifted elsewhere. This slow fading makes deserted villages both poignant and peaceful. There was no dramatic ending, only the quiet retreat of human presence. Archaeologists studying these landscapes today use tools both simple and advanced. Aerial photography reveals the outlines of old field systems. Ground surveys pick up subtle rises and hollows where walls once stood. In the earth, pottery fragments, nails, and animal bones confirm habitation. Together, These traces allow careful reconstruction of daily life, reminding us that even in absence, the memory of farming communities endures. The enduring lesson of deserted villages is one of impermanence. For all the persistence of medieval farmers, for all their resilience in the face of famine and toil, their settlements were not eternal. The soil they worked eventually reclaimed their homes. And yet, this is not a story of failure. It is the natural rhythm of history, in which places rise, flourish, and fade, leaving behind echoes for us to notice centuries later. To rest with these landscapes in imagination is to feel a gentle calm. Villages forgotten by time, fields no longer plowed, cottages softened into mounds beneath the grass. These are reminders that life's intensity eventually gives way to stillness. The medieval farmers are long gone, yet the marks of their endurance remain, silent and enduring, like whispers beneath the earth. To understand the full scope of medieval farming life, one must look not only at the furrows and cottages, but also at the looming presence of the manor house. For every cluster of peasant homes, there was usually a lord's dwelling nearby, sometimes modest and timbered, other times imposing in stone, standing apart yet closely bound to the rhythms of village survival. The manor was more than a residence. It was the center of local authority, the symbol of hierarchy, and the place where the divide between privilege and toil was most clearly visible. Imagine yourself approaching such a scene in the late 13th century. The air carries the mixed scent of tilled soil, livestock pens, and distant wood smoke. A dirt lane winds through fields of oats and barley before bending upward toward a larger structure. Rising above the thatched roofs of peasant cottages, the manor house asserts itself. It may not always be a castle with battlements, though some are fortified. Often it was a sturdy hall with thick walls, small windows, and a central hearth that glowed in the evenings. Surrounding it might be outbuildings, stables, perhaps even a small enclosed garden cultivated with herbs and greens unavailable to common villagers. The peasants, bound by custom and obligation, owed their labor to the lord of this estate. This relationship was complex, not merely one of exploitation, but also of interdependence. The lord provided protection, adjudicated disputes, and ensured that land could be worked. In return, peasants rendered services, days in the domain fields, a portion of their harvest, small rents in produce or coin, and even personal tasks such as repairing roads or carting timber. The manor court formalized these obligations, gathering peasants to hear proclamations, record dues, and resolve disagreements. It was here that the structure of medieval society was made visible in action. Inside the manor hall, life felt very different from the cramped cottages outside. The central hearth filled the space with warmth, smoke drifting toward a high roof. Long tables were arranged for meals, the lord and his family seated at the raised dais, guests and retainers below. Meals themselves were fuller and more varied than the peasant diet. Bread made from finer flour, meat from the lord's herds, fish preserved in salt, and wines imported from distant vineyards. Yet it is worth remembering that luxury in the Middle Ages was modest by modern standards. The walls might be draped with tapestries, but drafts slipped easily through cracks. Food could spoil quickly without ice or refrigeration. Lighting was dim, supplied by tallow candles that smoked as much as they illuminated. Even the manor was not exempt from the simplicity of the era. For peasants, the manor house loomed as both a place of power and necessity. They came to its gates on feast days, bringing gifts or tributes. They came to the court to hear rulings on land disputes. They came, often reluctantly, to fulfill their required labor, harvesting the lord's crops before tending their own. And yet, the manor was also a site of communal gatherings, festive occasions when lords provided ale, or when marriages and religious celebrations spilled into the hall. In such moments, the contrast between privilege and hardship softened into shared ritual, even if the hierarchy remained firm. Archaeological studies of manorial sites reveal both worlds intertwined. Excavations uncover remnants of fine ceramics near the manor kitchens, alongside coarse earthenware used by servants. Animal bones show cuts from better portions of meat reserved for elites, while peasants made do with tougher cuts or broths boiled until nourishment could be drawn from bone and marrow. Tools and ornaments alike show the presence of varied lives under one roof. Retainers with their belts and buckles, cooks with iron pots, scribes with wax tablets, children with small carved toys. The contrast between manor and cottage was not absolute separation, but rather a shared landscape of inequality. The manor relied on the peasants' labor. The peasants relied on the manor's structure of protection and order. Both existed within the same rhythm of seasons, tied to the harvest, to the parish church, to the weather that could bless or curse them alike. The manor did not stand outside the village, but within it, elevated in stature, but bound to the same fate of soil and sky. To drift further into this image is to see the symbolic weight of the manor. It was not merely a building. It was a visible reminder of authority, a center of both obligation and belonging. For peasants trudging home after a day's labor, the silhouette of the manor house against the setting sun was a familiar marker, a reminder of duty, but also of continuity. For the Lord, the sight of smoke rising from peasant hearths below was assurance of productivity, the quiet confirmation that the fields would yield. Thus the manor and the peasants stood in contrast, but also in harmony, each defining the other. Without the peasants, the manor was an empty hall. Without the manor, the peasants' labor lacked direction and order. In this balanced, if unequal, relationship lay the heart of medieval rural society. And as night settled, stars shining above both hall and cottage, the same chill air seeped into stone and thatch alike. Sleep, in the end, came to lord and laborer under the same sky. One of the most striking contrasts in the lives of medieval farmers lay not only in their relationship with the manor, but in the rhythm of abundance and scarcity. The medieval year was divided into seasons not only by weather, but by hunger and plenty, by lean months and times of celebration. To modern eyes, accustomed to markets where food flows year-round, the sharpness of this cycle can be difficult to imagine. Yet for medieval villagers, the memory of full granaries in autumn and the hollow echo of empty larders in late spring shaped the very fabric of existence. Imagine the months after harvest, when barns were stacked with sheaves of wheat and barley, when apples lay in baskets, when salted meat hung from rafters. The village at this time carried a sense of quiet relief. Fires burned in hearths with steady confidence, knowing fuel and food were stored. Feasts could be held at Christmas with bread, ale, perhaps even roasted goose or pork shared among households. The abundance did not erase hardship, but it softened the edge of worry. In these months, laughter carried more easily across the lanes, and families settled into winter with a measure of security. But as months passed, granaries slowly emptied. By late winter and early spring, the stores thinned. Meat barrels, once full, might contain only brine. Grain bins grew sparse, sometimes stretched by mixing in husks or less desirable crops. Lent, a season of fasting, coincided with these months, reinforcing the sense of scarcity. It was a spiritual discipline, but also a practical necessity. The hungry gap, as historians call it, could stretch for weeks, when last year's food was nearly gone, and this year's crops were not yet ready to harvest. During these lean months, creativity and endurance were essential. Villagers foraged for wild greens, nettles, sorrel, young shoots that pushed up despite the chill. They made thin broths from bones long simmered, or gruel from whatever grain remained. Bread was baked with mixtures of rye, oats, or peas, dense and coarse. Hunger was not always starvation, but it was an ever-present shadow. Children cried more often, elders grew weaker, and even the strongest laborers felt their strength diminished. It was in these months that the fragility of survival became most tangible. The contrast with times of feast was therefore immense. When harvest was good, when lords hosted celebrations, or when festivals of the church called for gatherings, the tables looked almost miraculously abundant. Imagine the manor hall at Michaelmas or Christmas. Roasted meats carried on platters, spiced puddings, ale flowing from casks, laughter rising to the beams. For peasants, these feasts were extraordinary interruptions to the daily monotony of porridge and bread. Even a small gift of extra food, a piece of cheese, a slice of pie, could feel like luxury, a moment of joy against the background of daily struggle. The social divide appeared clearly at such times. Lords and their households dined with more frequency and variety, their tables boasting imported wines, dried fruits, spices from distant lands. Peasants, by contrast, had little access to such things. Yet festivals often bridged the divide, as custom required lords to provide alms, distribute bread, or host communal meals. These moments of shared abundance, however fleeting, reinforced the ties of community and the cycle of obligation. Records from the period show the careful balancing of food supplies. Manor accounts list how many sheep were slaughtered, how much grain was threshed, how much ale brewed. Archaeological evidence of charred grains, animal bones, and storage pits confirms the rhythms of plenty and want. Such details, small and practical, reveal a truth that defined medieval life. Survival depended not only on labor, but on the delicate timing of the seasons. When famine struck, brought on by crop failure, heavy rains, or blight, the contrast between feast and famine deepened into tragedy. Chronicles describe years when hunger swept entire regions, when bread was scarce, when prices soared. These accounts do not dwell on horror in detail, yet their tone conveys the weight of suffering. Villages weakened, fields abandoned, lives cut short. And yet, through such cycles, communities persisted, adapting, rebuilding, and hoping always for the next good harvest. To rest in these images is to feel both the sharpness of the contrast and the softness of time's passing. The peasants who celebrated at Christmas and endured the hungry gap in spring lived not in constant despair, but in a rhythm they accepted as the order of things. They endured the lean months, knowing abundance would return, just as surely as the seasons turned. And in this patience lay a quiet resilience, a reminder of how deeply medieval life was shaped by nature's pulse. The cycle of feast and famine was thus more than a matter of food. It was the heartbeat of medieval society. It taught humility before the earth, gratitude in times of plenty, endurance in times of want. And as the sun rose and set over cottages and manors alike, both lord and peasant lived by this rhythm, bound together by the same soil, the same hunger, the same brief moments of celebration. In the medieval countryside, authority and faith formed the twin pillars shaping daily life. On one side stood the Lord with obligations and powers rooted in land and law. On the other stood the parish with its church and priest, binding the community in rituals of faith. Between them lived the peasant, navigating duties to both, carrying burdens, but also finding belonging in these structures. To understand the farmer's world, we must see how these two forces, earthly and spiritual, intertwined. The parish church was often the most solid building in a village. Its walls of stone or timbered frame stood firmer than cottages of wattle and daub. A tower or spire might rise modestly, visible across fields, guiding both travelers and locals. The church bell marked the rhythm of time, calling people to Mass, tolling for funerals, ringing on feast days. Inside, light filtered through narrow windows, illuminating painted walls with saints, angels, and biblical stories. For the peasant, who owned little and lived simply, the church was a place of awe, where heaven touched earth through ceremony and prayer. Faith was not a matter of choice in the modern sense. It was the fabric of life. The agricultural year was measured not only by planting and harvest, but also by the calendar of saints' days and festivals. Candlemas, Easter, Pentecost, Michaelmas, all gave shape to the cycle of labor and rest. Feasts were not mere breaks, but holy obligations, times when even toil bent to the rhythm of the sacred. The church reinforced patience in hunger, gratitude in abundance, and endurance in hardship. It taught peasants that suffering on earth had meaning, that rewards awaited beyond this life, and that obedience was a form of devotion. The Lord's authority, meanwhile, was closer and more tangible. He collected rents, demanded labor, held courts of justice, and commanded the use of land. The manor court could fine a peasant for letting animals stray, for neglecting obligations, or for failing to maintain ditches and hedges. To modern eyes, such oversight feels heavy-handed, but in medieval society, it was expected. The Lord's justice, however imperfect, was the framework that maintained order, ensuring that disputes did not spiral into chaos. For the peasant, navigating between parish and manor meant balancing the sacred and the secular. One day might bring labor in the domain fields under the steward's eye. The next, attendance at Mass, listening to sermons about sin, salvation, and humility. One obligation demanded food and labor, the other prayer and obedience. Yet these worlds overlapped. Lords funded churches, priests blessed harvests, and festivals often combined both authority and faith in shared ritual. Consider the great harvest celebrations. When crops were gathered, a portion was offered to the church as tithe. Priests blessed the fields, thanking God for abundance. Lords, too, claimed their share through rents and dues. The peasants stood in the middle, offering grain to altar and hall alike, aware that both earthly and heavenly authority required acknowledgement. This dual duty was burdensome, yet it also reinforced belonging. The farmer was not alone, but part of a larger, ordered world. Archaeological traces confirm the presence of this layered life. Excavations at parish sites uncover fragments of devotional objects, small crosses, pilgrim badges, rosary beads, simple yet meaningful. Manor records preserve fines and obligations, written carefully in Latin by scribes who rarely imagined the quiet weight their words would carry centuries later. Together, they remind us how authority and faith were etched into the daily rhythm of farming communities. It would be easy to view this relationship as purely oppressive, but such a picture oversimplifies. The church offered consolation, a sense of purpose in suffering. Lords provided structure, defense, and continuity. Of course, abuses existed, greedy landlords, corrupt priests, but alongside them was the steady pattern of mutual dependence. For the peasant, life was not constant rebellion, but endurance within systems that, however unequal, provided order. At night, when the bell of the parish tolled across the fields, its sound reached manor and cottage alike. The lord in his hall heard it just as surely as the peasant at his hearth. Authority and faith were not abstractions, but lived realities, binding people together across divides. The church's prayers, the Lord's commands, and the peasant's labor all formed parts of the same fabric. As we drift with this image, imagine the stillness of a medieval village after sunset. Smoke rises in faint threads from low cottages. The manor's outline rests dark against the horizon. The church bell has rung the last time for the day, and silence spreads. Under the same sky, lord and laborer, priest and peasant lie down to rest. Authority and faith will resume their weight with the morning sun, but in the quiet of night, all lives share the same rhythm of breath, the same embrace of sleep. Come to the end of our long journey through the lives of medieval farmers. What we have seen is not a story of heroes or great battles, but of ordinary persistence. Theirs was a world defined by rhythm, the rising and setting of the sun, the turning of the seasons, the balance of labor and rest. It was a life that moved at the pace of soil, seed, and harvest. Across these hours, we have walked among villagers whose days were shaped by necessity. We have seen their cottages, warmed by hearths that smoked into low rafters. We have heard the bell of the parish, calling them to worship and binding them in faith. We have glimpsed the manor house, looming with authority, yet dependent on the same fields that sustain the humble. And we have stood in fields where villages once stood, now silent, but still bearing the faint outlines of vanished lives. To reflect on their existence is to recognize the deep contrast that defined it. Feast and famine, labor and celebration, authority and obedience, fragility and resilience. Yet through all of these contrasts, one quality endures: continuity. The medieval farmer endured because he and she found ways to persist, to weave meaning into hardship, and a trust that seasons of want would turn into seasons of plenty once again. And as you listen now, perhaps drifting between waking and sleep, you may sense the steady comfort of that rhythm. The problems of the medieval farmer were heavy, but they were simple in their constancy. Sow, reap, endure, repeat. Today, in a world of constant noise and ceaseless change, there is something strangely calming in that simplicity. So as you settle more deeply into rest, let the images of the medieval countryside fade gently in your mind. Fields stretching to the horizon, smoke rising from cottages at dusk, a parish bell echoing across quiet lanes. Picture the silence of a village long abandoned, softened by grass, reclaimed by earth, yet still whispering of lives once lived. The farmers of the Middle Ages are gone, but their story remains, humble, steady, and enduring. And now, as you close your eyes, you may let their rhythm carry you too. Their days have ended, their nights are silent, and their lives have faded into history. But the peace of their endurance remains, ready to guide you into sleep beneath the same timeless sky. If this journey has brought you calm, you are welcome to return whenever you need rest. And if it has eased you into slumber, then perhaps the medieval farmers have given you one last gift, the gift of stillness. So now, with the story complete, let your breathing deepen, let your thoughts drift, and let sleep arrive as softly as the evening bell across a quiet field. Good night, and rest well.